Welcome to the Emerging Civil War Podcast. I'm Chris Mackowski, and we've got an all-star lineup for you today to talk about Uncle Billy Sherman, a man that people love to love and a man people love to hate. And I've got some great Sherman experts with us today. I'm going to start with our chief historian, Cecily Zander, who may or may not be joined by her dog, Mo. We all love Mo, so if he pops up and has something to say or not, that would be great to have him. Cecily, now you maybe need to correct me on this, but I think you told me once upon a time you've read nearly every word Sherman wrote. Is that true?
I think it feels like it, but I also don't know that that's possible because the dude never stopped writing.
That
So
would be quite a mountain.
yeah.
But nonetheless, you've spent a lot of time with his writings.
Yeah, and a lot of it Civil War, but a lot of it is postbellum writing too. I mean, he had a long career in the U.S. Army, and he spent a lot of that in charge, so he had to write a lot of reports. The Army does love bureaucracy, so
doesn't it though? Doesn't it? So I'm going to go around my computer screen here at least. I'm going to hit Dave Powell next. Dave is working on a monumental study of the Atlanta campaign, and of course, the chief Union protagonist in that story is William T. Sherman. Dave, how are you today?
I'm good. How are you, man?
I'm doing well. Thank you very much. Thanks for being with us today. And last but not least would be ECW's official Sherman biographer, Derek Maxfield, who wrote the book Man of Fire. Derek, how are you today?
I'm doing great.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, I appreciate you guys being with us today. So my premise here is whether or not William T. Sherman was overrated. And I want to sort of like lay out my breadcrumbs that got me to just ask this question. And I don't have an answer for it, so that's why I thought I'd get three smart Sherman people together to talk about it. So when I was working on my book about the Battle of Jackson, Mississippi, then I was also looking at stuff about the siege of Jackson, Mississippi, which takes place in mid-July, right after Vicksburg falls. And Grant gives Sherman an order that says, don't come into the city. I want you to turn around and go get Joe Johnston. And so then Sherman goes after Joe Johnston. They have the siege of Jackson, and Johnson evacuates the city and vanishes. And then Sherman's basically like, there, got him. And he goes back to the city, but he doesn't really destroy Johnston like Grant had asked him to, which to me just seemed like an underperformance. And, you know, we've put that in the context of the Battle of Chattanooga, where he's supposed to attack the north end of Missionary Ridge and ends up getting bottled up by Claiborne at Tunnel Hill, and some of the problems that he has with Johnston through the Atlanta campaign. And then, of course, that got me to back up, and I was thinking about Chickasaw Bayou. Everybody has a bad day, a bad battle, so I don't know if that's an underperformance or not. But then I even was backing up further, and I thought, like, gosh, after First Manassas, and Sherman gets sent to the west, and like Albert Sidney Johnston causes him to have a nervous breakdown. And that's that part where he's crazy and has to be out of the Army for a little bit. So just as I'm kind of piecing these pieces together, I thought, is he overblown? Is he overrated? Is there more to Uncle Billy Sherman or not? So Cecily, let me start with you. Just as I lay that set of ideas out there, any initial reaction? We can parse it out in more detail in a second, but any initial reaction?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting you sort of point out, of those sort of conflicts, I've thought the most about sort of Sherman's approach to Atlanta and how kind of slow that feels to us sometimes, especially since we know he was facing Joe Johnston for much of it. And we know that Joe Johnston loved nothing more than to retreat. He woke up every day thinking, oh, it's a great day to retreat. But Sherman didn't seem as aggressive as his reputation kind of in the zeitgeist. We think of him as an uber aggressive kind of guy, and his approach to Atlanta, he kind of takes his cues from Johnston. It seems to me that what you're pointing out is like Sherman rising to the level of the opponent that he is facing. And so that could be something we use to kind of moderate the discussion. Does he fight Joe Johnston at a different level than he fights John Bell Hood? Does he fight Albert Sidney Johnston in a different way? Sidney Johnston being one of the best generals the Confederates thought they had, maybe that mattered to Sherman. And again, he would have known Sidney Johnston from the old Army. He would have had an awareness of what he was facing. So yeah, I wonder if there's something to the question of, does the opposition matter for Sherman's performance? And is he the type of guy who kind of meets people where they're at rather than exceeding his opponent?
Okay, all right, very good. So she's evoking Atlanta. So Dave, that means I've got to send it over to you because you're deep in the Atlanta campaign yourself right now.
I am. So the first thing that always strikes me as about Sherman is that he is not a tactician. When it comes to operating on a battlefield, maneuvering brigades and divisions, he never does well. It's one of the reasons why Sherman is not a big fan of battles. I think he understands some of his own limitations there. So the Chickasaw Bayou and the stumbling at Missionary Ridge, those are more in character with Sherman rather than out of character. The other factor that's always very interesting to me is that for a senior Army officer, Sherman lacks that sort of killer instinct. And I'll give you an example. I'll give you a couple of examples. There are a couple of times during the war where Sherman has the advantage. He has a manpower advantage. He has positional advantage, and yet he can't quite close that fist. And that's true at Jonesboro in September 1864, when he's got almost all of his army arranged against one Confederate infantry corps under Hardee. And that's true at Bentonville on the second day at Bentonville, when he has really the 2.5 to 1 advantage in numbers over what Joe Johnston's remnant of an army in North Carolina. And in each case, they get away. They realize their peril, they retreat, and Sherman doesn't make much of an effort to go after them, similar to what you were describing at Jackson. So with those two characteristics in mind, I think Sherman is sort of he has much greater skills operationally. He can maneuver an army. He does so through North Georgia pretty well. He makes mistakes, but then all commanders make mistakes. And I've come to the conclusion that I think Joe Johnston was very passive during that campaign. Mm-hmm. Cecily says, every day is a great day to retreat. And if there's one thing Johnston masters in the Atlanta campaign, it's that retreat. So
he may be retreating right now, even still. So, Derek, let me ask you to chime in here with sort of the last word on the first question.
Well, I have two thoughts. First of all, Mackowski, I think that this is in part about Stonewall Jackson, don't you? I think that the whole question is centered around, the criticism Jackson's come in for, and you're making a parallel here.
No, actually, that isn't. But although we could do a separate podcast about that.
I couldn't help throwing that at you, though. I think that whether he's overrated or not depends upon your definition of success, really. Are you asking about his tactical skills? Are you asking about his operational skills? Are you talking about his strategy? You cannot argue with the fact that he's successful overall. He's the second biggest hero of the Republic at the end of the war, But don't get me wrong. I think that he did make plenty of mistakes during the war. I agree with Dave that he wasn't a good tactician, but I do admire his greater vision. I do admire his courage in undertaking something like the March to the Sea, which was a daunting prospect and one that Grant wasn't certain of after all. And if you look at the writing during the war about his views of government and Reconstruction, most famously writing to Halleck about this when asked, he shows kind of a greater vision than just simply a military one. But then, if it's very broad and you are asking about him overrated or not, does this discussion also include what he does out on the Great Plains after the war and those things too?
Yeah.
It's undeniable that he is one of the most important military commanders, whether or not he's overrated.
Okay, very good, very good. So now I hear a couple good things for us to work with here. So you guys talk about that broader vision, and we see that with the surrender terms he and Johnston work out at the Bennett Place, for instance, thinking really big there. And then Dave, I like your comments about sort of very successful as an operational commander. So let's kind of back up to early in his career during the war and after First Manassas, he gets sent out west. And I'm kind of thinking maybe someone with a big canvas like the West, he's in Kentucky and thinking broad geographically, thinking about implications of the war. He's the one who says this isn't going to be over in just a flash in the pan. It's going to cost thousands and thousands of lives. Um, and then just having that large geography to manage army movements through. Cecily, I'm seeing you kind of nodding your head as I'm spooling this out. Is he the right guy to send out there? Halleck, of course, being in charge, but he's one of Halleck's key subordinates at that point.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And again, this is the kind of trouble that the United States finds itself in through the first couple of years of the war. They're kind of waiting for the cream to rise to the top. They aren't sure yet who their best people are. And I think we forget sometimes, of course, Grant will go on to eclipse Sherman, but at the time the war begins, Sherman's in charge of an actual military academy in Louisiana. Grant is working in his father's tannery in Ohio. Grant's a nobody, Sherman's a somebody. And so while we might think, oh, wouldn't it have made more sense to send Grant out there because we know what Grant becomes? Sherman actually starts the war sort of significantly ahead of Grant in terms of how people estimated his ability. And so I think that's really important too. We could ask ourselves, who else did they have? We know how much Lincoln struggles in the East to find anyone capable of leading an army. The same problem occurs in the West, even though, I think Grant slowly kind of makes his way there. I just finished teaching Vicksburg to my students in Civil War history. And I said, and guess what, guys? This is still not enough for Grant to have shown to Lincoln that he is the guy for the job. And they were shocked. They were like, what else does this guy have to do? And I think we have to keep that in mind too. It took a long time for a lot of these guys to kind of prove their mettle. And Lincoln, in some ways, remarkably had the patience to wait for that to happen. But I don't know that Sherman was the wrong choice. He had the pedigree, certainly, and the experience, but I think the size of the problem overwhelmed him, especially because everyone was talking about how important that theater was. I mean, Kentucky is all you hear through the first 2 years of the war. To lose Kentucky is the same as to lose the whole game. And I think that pressure builds in the backs of Sherman's minds too, because if we think of him as a strategist rather than a tactician, he knows how important it is. And I think he gets overwhelmed, but I think it's also, we can have a little empathy for the guy. That was a pretty significant challenge and a lot of pressure to put on one person so early in the war.
Yeah. Derek, do you think, is he the right guy to be out there? Is he in the right situation?
Why not? When you look at what's available to you, who else are you going to send there, right? I think that we have to remember too that Halleck and Sherman were quite close. Halleck will be one of the great backstabbers of the war with Sherman, but Sherman doesn't know that until very late in the war. But, their friendship goes back to the old army, and they were pretty tight, And so I think that Halleck had a certain empathy. He certainly wanted to court the support of the Ewings and Senator Sherman, too, in protecting the interests of William Tecumseh Sherman. But I think why not?
Yeah, you mentioned that about Halleck, and I mean, with Sherman and with Grant, Sherman sort of plays both sides of that fence all the way until Halleck gets transferred to the West. Is trying to be friends with both of them, even though the two of them are really kind of butting heads in some sorts of ways. Dave is thinking about early war Sherman, and he goes out west. He's stacked up against Albert Sidney Johnson. If he's not a general, the South doesn't have one, sort of thing.
Right.
Is he the right guy for that?
Well, early in the war, probably nobody's the right guy because nobody really has the experience. And you could send McClellan out there. He doesn't really, so what it comes down to with Sherman's not a bad choice in terms of his pedigree, and he's already had some combat experience. I think what really undoes him in 1861 is not so much Kentucky, but also the continual pressure that comes out of Washington for him to go to East Tennessee. 2 years later, writing to Grant, and I love quoting Sherman because he is so quotable. Yeah. He writes to Grant on the march to Chattanooga in the fall of 1863, after all of that's happened. He writes, "You recall, East Tennessee is my horror. he still has, I think, PTSD over the pressure that he gets from Washington. What's also remarkable about Sherman is that there are few generals in the war that get as many second chances as William T. Sherman. Right. They get, some guys are one and done. Some guys, they do well, then they blow it. John Pope, and boom, Pope is gone out of the rest of the war. He's off in Minnesota. But Sherman is going to have that trouble in Louisville in 1861. He will be rehabbed, and it's really actually the piece of it that fits, that clicks with Sherman, is when he does meet Grant, because then you form one of the great military teams of the war, and the two trust each other implicitly. And as much as any tactical or strategic ability, any political ability, armies are built on teams, and that pair is going to make them important all through the rest of the war.
And if I look at how Sherman performs as the war goes on, and he keeps getting buoyed by Grant, who kind of gives him the next chance, the next chance, the next chance, even as Grant, is getting that next chance too. But sometimes maybe under circumstances that other guys might get fired for. That loyalty between Grant and Sherman seems to be really key. Derek, tell me a little bit about your perception of that relationship that David just talked about.
I have tried for years to figure out why these two would ever become friends. One is so passive, almost shy, very reticent, and Sherman is fiery and impulsive, right? Intense man. And I've been struggling with, because I portray Grant on the stage, of course, and I have to try to get inside his head. And I think that it's got to be something, maybe at Shiloh, that caused these two to make common cause and to understand each other better. I think it's got to be not military, but personality. Something clicks with the two of them that just works, because the trust that Grant shows in Sherman from very early on. I'm talking about the days of Fort Henry and Donelson, when Sherman, I think, was at Paducah and was, forwarding men and supplies down there. Even then, Grant seemed to show trust in Sherman, and I think wrote about it in reports afterwards. There was already something that Grant admired in him.
Yeah, I suppose one might say the same thing about my own marriage. Who can tell how these two people came together and yet somehow they still work? And that's probably true of most marriages. Cecily, how would you characterize that relationship between Grant and Sherman?
Yeah, I think that is what Derek says is so right. You can kind of imagine them sitting in a room together and just thinking, did Grant say any words? Did Sherman say 100% of the words? Like that surely must have been kind of how things played out between the two of them. But I think, again, Sherman puts it best when he recognizes his own limitations and recognizes one of Grant's great strengths. And for someone like Sherman, who had the reputation he had when he wrote about that relationship, to admit one of his greatest flaws is really, really interesting. But I think that is certainly something that Grant could respect in him, that Sherman did not have. Even though we might think of him as having a massive ego, he actually did not. And what he constantly says about Grant, and their friendship, which evolves over the course of Grant's presidency after the war, he says that, Grant had this sort of serene ability to never be worried about what the enemy was doing on the other side of the battlefield. And it's all I could think about. And that is Sherman right there, recognizing his limitations as a soldier. And I think he gets exactly what Dave and Derek said about him as a tactician. Like, he gets so obsessed in this minutia that he actually becomes paralyzed. And he said that never happens to Grant. And that's why I like to work with him, because he has the ability to do that and I do not. And I think sort of recognizing each other's limitations and strength also help them do that. And I think, when Grant becomes, goes east and sort of sets up his multi-pronged effort to kind of get at the Confederacy, which involves, movement down on the Red River and through the Shenandoah Valley, and his own movement in the Overland Campaign, and Sherman Sherman's the only one who pulls off even a single portion of his offensive, his designated offensive. And I think that really matters too. I think Grant had no question that Sherman would pull off what he needed to do. I think he had a lot of question whether Nathaniel Banks was going to get anywhere when he gives Nathaniel Banks a really similar order.
And of course, the relationship well explored, probably most famously in Charles Braceland's Flood's book about the friendship that saved the Union. Let me back up just a little bit, because before the two of them really connect, and Sherman did outrank Grant at the beginning of, when they first start working together. But Cecily, I really liked how you sort of talked about Sherman gets so overwhelmed he freezes up, and that's maybe at the core of why he needs to take a break from Kentucky. And a lot of people know that he had problems at some point, but they don't necessarily know what it was, when it was. Dave, let me start with you this time here as I work my way around my Hollywood squares. Tell me a little bit about that moment in history and kind of what causes Sherman to snap and why, and how does he react to that?
I think the pressure to conduct an offensive all the way down into Knoxville in East Tennessee in 1861 with very limited resources. And when he starts talking to everyone about how many troops he's going to need, and he says it'll take 200,000 men, and the authorities in Washington and almost all the military people around him are like, that's crazy. We're not going to have 200,000 men. I really do.
Oops.
Yeah. I really do think that coupled with the worry about the Confederates, what the Confederates are doing early on in the war, it's interesting if you spend time with those early 1861 comments, how little the North knew about the South and how little the South knew about the North in terms of troops. And so you get these wildly inflated estimates. Albert Sidney Johnston does have 250,000 men in the West, and nobody's stopping to think, well, how is he arming and equipping that many people that fast? We can't arm and equip our people that way. And we have much greater resources than the Confederacy. So there's not a lot of critical thought going into those early war periods. There's just a lot of sort of outrageous overestimate and a lot of panicky talk. Washington's going to be invaded, onto Richmond, all of this sort of early war fever that I think all of that combines to simply overwhelm him. And Sherman does have kind of an excitable, overthinking personality, as I'm sure Cecily will attest.
Cecily and Derek are both nodding their heads like, we got bobbleheads going on here. Everyone's like, yeah.
I think it's actually more interesting to me is the relationship that Grant has with Sherman immediately after Shiloh. Now, Sherman commands the division on the outer line at Shiloh. It's primarily his action or lack of action that allows the Union Army to be surprised at Shiloh. And Grant could have easily thrown him under the bus. Grant did, in fact, do that with Lew Wallace and McClernand, blaming them or accusing them of incompetence, really unfairly. And yet, he hasn't known Sherman all that well or all that long, and yet that friendship is such. And this is a characteristic of Grant throughout the war, really throughout his life, is if you're a friend of Grant's, he will stand by you. He will do as much as he can to protect you and ensure the friendship continues. He's very loyal, sometimes to a fault. Yeah. But that moment at Shiloh could have been the ruin of Sherman's career, certainly. Instead, it only deepens the bond between them. So that kind of that helps Sherman get a hold of his own particular qualms, I think.
And I'll come back to Shiloh in a second. As I was laying out my argument at the beginning of the program, I skipped over Shiloh, and Sherman certainly has some problems there. Let me just kind of explore this kind of period where Sherman's crazy for just a couple more minutes here. Derek, I want to give you the opportunity to comment on it. Is this a like dark night of the soul for Sherman before he finally kind of comes back into action, or how do you see that period?
Well, after he's relieved and sent home, maybe. But I've looked at this very closely when I wrote about this, trying to deconstruct this and pull it apart and find out what really happened here. One of the things that occurs to me, of course, is that understanding mental illness, for example, is a difficult thing looking back on it 150, 160 years later and trying to see it, because otherwise, it's pretty easy to see anxiety there. Sherman never wanted to be in charge out there, you'll recall. He said that it was his horror and he didn't want to lead. And then he finds himself suddenly in command of that department when his friend Anderson retires, right? But I think that the rumors of him being insane are based really on one meeting with the Secretary of War who came through about this time. And I think that you've got to understand the nature of Sherman first, and then understand the stress he was under second, right? So under normal circumstances, the guy's intense, he's nervous and fidgety, he's a talkaholic, he smokes constantly, he's an insomniac, right? I think that when people say that somebody's stampeded, in part, Sherman was stampeded by the propaganda campaign of Albert Sidney Johnston. And when he has the opportunity to say to the Secretary of War in person at that meeting, Sherman's told, well, you've got an hour of my time and then I got to be on my way. And Sherman thinks, I got to get this right. I've got to impart all of this important information to this man while I have him in front of me, right? The mistake was that he did all the talking in front of reporters that were with the Secretary of War. But if you take Sherman, who is normally intense and fidgety and nervous, then you add the stress, and then you think about, well, I've got this important person in front of me, I got to make my case quickly. What you get is Sherman kind of on steroids, and he comes off as absolutely unhinged because of all these factors. It was the perfect storm, And I think that if you've never met Sherman before and you don't know his personality normally, and then you meet him under these conditions, of course he's going to come off as, a bit crazy, right? This man is a maniac. And then this gets reported in the press, I think it's a combination of things that cause this. But, the fact that he recovers from this, gets back on the saddle, so to speak, and is back trusted with command again pretty quickly. Well, it's partly political, but it's partly because, Sherman doesn't want to give up. He doesn't want to go into retirement. He doesn't want to hide under his bed, which I probably would do if somebody made a headline that said that I was insane.
Cecily, as Sherman bounces back from this really rough spot early on in the war, how hard or how easy is it for him to get back on his feet? And, how does he conduct himself in the wake of all that?
Yeah, I think he becomes sort of really determined not to show that kind of weakness again. And I think this partly explains what goes on at Shiloh. I think he went into Shiloh sort of thinking, I'm not going to be misled by reports, exaggerated reports of 100,000 enemies coming my way. And I'm not going to be, taken advantage of, and I'm not going to let them drive me crazy. And it actually leads him to make the mistake that kind of Dave alludes to. He doesn't fortify his line where he should, because he thinks everybody's lying to him about how many troops the rebels have at Corinth. And he doesn't do anything to fortify the line. He doesn't do anything to protect it. I think both him and Grant are sort of culpable here. They should have been coordinating and trying to figure out how much they needed to reinforce the kind of mouth of that kind of curve that they had set up. But I think kind of the two things go hand in hand. Sherman's recovery and his determination to not be to let flights of fancy distract him from what he really needs to do leads him to make this mistake where he's like, well, it's clearly fanatical to assume the rebels have that many men at Corinth, when they in fact did, and they were coming straight for him on the Tennessee River.
So in that sense, the pendulum swings the other way, and he gets caught there. And Dave, you'd mentioned that that Corinth, I mean, that Shiloh's kind of a rough spot for him. He deploys his men as they get off the boats and kind of making room for the rest of the army to get in. Doesn't fortify, gets himself caught off guard, has some very intense fighting during that first day. So does he perform well at Shiloh? Does he save his own bacon at Shiloh? Like, how do you assess the fight at Shiloh and Sherman's performance there in light of the fact that he's the one, as you say, that kind of responsible for a lot of that?
Well, everything up till about 8 o'clock of April 6th, 8 o'clock in the morning of April 6th, he doesn't do very well. And this goes to Grant too. They don't really think about where to deploy the troops. They're just looking for good campgrounds. They don't put any of the veteran troops on the outer line so that they have trained, tested troops. Instead, they take the greenest regiments in the army and they slap them together to make brigades out of them, and they build new divisions. The 5th and 6th divisions are brand new. There are literally troops marching onto the battlefield that morning without ammunition. They have just unloaded at the landing. I mean, it's that kind of raw. And Sherman famously tells one Ohio colonel, take your damn regiment back to Ohio. There's no troop enemy nearer than Corinth, etc. And there's a fairly large skirmish on Friday that probably should have alerted the army but didn't. But then once he realizes they're attacked, he's shot in the hand, takes and whirls around and rushes back to his main divisional line, and then they fight very well for the next couple of hours. And Sherman holds on; he doesn't fall to pieces. He sort of calms down, actually. Once he has to perform, that excitability sort of fades away, which is another interesting characteristic of his. He's actually pretty calm in battle. And you wouldn't, if you met Sherman like the Secretary of War did, you'd think this is the last guy who's going to retain his composure in a stressful situation. And yet he does. So that obviously helps him a great deal. And the troops know that, and they see him as a fighting general now because he's everywhere on their part of the line. Everybody recognizes him. That's a very stabilizing and, for the soldiers, uplifting thing to know that your commander is there and he seems calm. He's not freaked out.
And Derek, we have that great scene that night where Sherman, pretty stressed out, and he finds Grant, and Devil's had his day, and Grant says, "Well, look him tomorrow." And so there's that calm center of the storm that kind of helps keep Sherman grounded as that battle goes on. Derek, how do you assess Sherman's performance over the course of that battle?
Well, I don't think I can do any better than Dave has. I do think that it is interesting that his personality transforms in combat into something almost serene, and he has charisma, and his troops, when they see that he's not going to fall apart, rally. I think, yeah, he and Grant were surprised. Both of them are culpable about this. But after that, I think Sherman performs as well as he can. I mean, later it's even said when, as a reason he should be promoted is that he helped save the army on the first day.
Very good. Cecily, any other Shiloh assessment on your part?
No, I don't think so. The sort of, to come back to sort of maybe one reason at that battle why Grant and Sherman seem to find each other, and maybe they reject some of the other officers or even seek to blame them. They have a regular army bond, and we also have to remember that sort of both Sherman and Grant look at volunteers with a good deal of suspicion, and Dave kind of mentioned that sending the volunteer regiments home, it's the regular army guys. So also thinking about Shiloh, it's still early enough in the war that there's some uneasiness between the volunteers and the regular army men and the degree to which they can trust each other. And I think Shiloh's a really formative moment where a lot of the volunteers, as Derek just said, some sort of come to see Sherman as not someone to fear, not the kind of martinet that they think all regular Army officers are, but someone that they can get behind. And that's a really important thing too. It happens in 1862 that you kind of have to start to break down those divisions and those resentments between professional soldiers and the volunteers. And I think Shiloh is a key moment for that. But it also may explain sort of Grant and Sherman being loyal to one another and less loyal to men like Wallace and McClernand, who are volunteer politician kind of officers.
That sounds like an answer from someone who's written a book about anti-military bias in America. Cecily's great book on the subject.
It is.
Give it a good plug there. To me, that period after Shiloh, when Halleck shows up, takes command of the army, Grant's in limbo, to me, that is one of those really, I think, important moments of glue between Grant and Sherman, because Grant's chafing at the bit and Sherman saying, be patient. There'll be some happy accident that will restore your proper place, and go make your headquarters back in Memphis, see what you can make out of it. And then that happy accident occurs, and Grant suddenly finds himself in the catbird seat. And it's really because Sherman had talked him into staying with it and not resigning. And so that's a really, really, I think, important revolution in their relationship, not just evolution. So that then is going to kick off events that head toward Vicksburg, and Sherman's going to get a pretty leading role in that first part as he heads down the river toward Chickasaw Bayou, trying to basically take command of troops that John McClernand otherwise might have been in command of as part of McClernand's maneuverings against Grant, sort of
just conveniently hijack a corps. Yes.
Yeah. How does Sherman perform throughout that? Because there's certainly a military component that will culminate with Chickasaw Bayou, and we can talk about Arkansas Post after that if you want to. But there's also that political and that intrigue that's going on, and I don't know how aware Sherman is of that. But how does Sherman kind of perform in your estimation during that November-December stretch? Derek, let me pitch that to you if you don't mind.
Well, I think that he is a bit unnerved by the overland campaign against Vicksburg and the rush back to Memphis to steal that group of men that were supposed to be part of McClernand's campaign.
And when you're talking about overland campaign against Vicksburg, we're talking about like that expedition down to Holly Springs toward Oxford.
Right. When he's, sent downriver to try to get on the other side while Grant is holding Pemberton's attention ostensibly upland, I think he's unnerved by this assignment a bit. He goes down, he has to cooperate with the Navy here, and he knows nothing of the lay of the land. When he's trying to make an assault against Chickasaw Bluff, they don't have good maps. The land is unknown to him. They didn't scout it well enough, and it turns into a disaster. I think all of those things affect what happens here.
Cecily, how about you? How do you think Sherman's handled himself with all these other factors going on?
I think he does pretty well. I think this is where perhaps if you're talking about kind of all of the intrigue that's playing out in the background, I think he tries to shut it out. He tried to do this as much as possible until the point when he physically bars reporters from being anywhere near his army, right? But I think this is maybe where the seeds of that get planted. I think this is Sherman trying to shut out the distraction. And I think this is, for a guy whose brain was probably significantly somewhere on the ADHD spectrum, I think it was hard enough, and political intrigue was something he was not interested in. And he's kind of happy to leave that to other officers. But I think Sherman assessed the Vicksburg campaign really well. I mean, he said we must control the Mississippi sort of source and mouth. He knew that, but he also considered it one of the hardest campaigns, I believe, that he took part in during the war. So he approached it with intense focus, which is what it needed. Kind of he and Grant, this is their kind of the culmination of their great partnership, because kind of after this, I mean, they'll go on down to Tennessee together, but this is really the kind of defining moment at which they have to work kind of hand in hand to unlock this puzzle piece, this great puzzle piece at Vicksburg. And so I think he's invested in that as well. But yeah, I think this may be where the seeds are kind of planted of Sherman's resentment of political intrigue in the army. Because of how important Vicksburg is, I think it was inevitable, but I think he here kind of stakes his intention not to let that enter into what he's doing on the battlefield.
And McClernand certainly brings an explicitly political component to that whole campaign because, of course, he is a politician and that's why he has his position. But he's also just an incredible self-promoter. And I don't say that lightly because there are plenty of self-promoters in the Army, but he really amplifies that. And so it's almost like you can't escape it. And that's the kind of environment that Sherman just absolutely loathes, and he has it thrust upon him. He calls McClernand my demon spirit. I mean, he just loathes the man. Dave, tell me a little bit about how you see Sherman navigating that period, and kind of how it either helps or hinders him.
Well, first of all, I think Sherman is very aware of the politics involved. His brother's a senator, after all, and he corresponds with his brother on a regular basis. The other thing to remember is that by this time, Grant has his own essentially propaganda machine. Most Union Army commanders by then do have friendly journalists and political confidants. Usually one or two confidants, connections in Washington, congressmen, senators, and so. So I think Sherman is pretty aware of it, and you're right, he loathes McClernand. I think McClernand, along with John Logan, are some of the more unfairly treated soldiers of the war. I think McClernand is much better as a soldier than history has let him be. That said, he's also a politician, and he rubbed a lot of people the wrong way, a lot of professional Army men. So, with the exception of the assault at Chickasaw Bayou, which was hurried and disastrous, there was, by and large, it was the campaign down there was successful. It gave them a lodgment downriver near Vicksburg. Sherman turned around and secured his rear by capturing Arkansas Post. I think a lot of the prep work for the Vicksburg campaign is accomplished in that period. The one exception is the assault itself, which probably should not have happened. Certainly, if it did happen, should have happened in other tactical ways. But also, I think Sherman felt kind of forced into it. He had to strike a quick blow. Maybe we can capture the city. Everybody's expecting it. So,
and when you talk about those assaults, and then that sort of makes me flash forward to May when Sherman also is sort of charged with making some assaults there, and do that quick blow where we might catch the Confederates offhand or off guard. Where Grant is really kind of thinking of Sherman as a hammer. Let me get my guy in there. He's the one that Grant's really trusting with this hard fighting in a lot of these circumstances at Vicksburg, and doesn't successfully break through on the 19th, doesn't successfully break through in the subsequent attacks on the 22nd, and yet that still doesn't dent Grant's confidence in him, which I think is pretty fascinating. Cecily, give me your overall assessment of Sherman's performance in the Vicksburg campaign. I mean, you can pick it up from Chickasaw Bayou or wherever you want to.
I think he does, really well, and it's the choice not to question what Grant wants him to do. Like, he makes those assaults regardless of their success, and then he comes back, as you said, a couple of days later and tries again. And so he's willing to be used as the hammer. And I think what's really important for Sherman in the Vicksburg campaign is he could have had just as much claim to be the guy in charge of that campaign, or at least sort of co-equal in terms of its authorship with Grant. And he does exactly what Grant wants. He kind of puts himself in line in the kind of the order of kind of hierarchy there for the campaign, and does what he's asked. So I think he does pretty well. He keeps his head down for the most part. It's funny, you were describing him, sort of Grant's willingness to use him, to trust him to kind of use discretion and carry out the orders that Grant gives him. Again, when you get back to sort of what Derek said, he's sort of a Stonewall Jackson to Robert E. Lee in that situation. Grant knew, right, that Sherman was never going to be a Dick Ewell. Like, he could give Sherman an order and expect Sherman to execute it. And I think that's really important. And I think Grant learns that about Sherman in the Vicksburg campaign. And if anything, that's what gives Grant the confidence to tell Sherman, you know, I'm going to Washington and you're going to Atlanta, and I know you're going to do it.
Yeah, even so far as like Sherman says, I don't support this plan to invade Mississippi, but I'm going to do it because Grant says so, and I think it's going to fail, but I'm going to do it because Grant and Grant knows this, and he still trusts Sherman, and Sherman still executes and gets some pretty dicey assignments, you know, bringing up the rear guard and some of those sorts of things, being left behind in Jackson when the rest of the army is moving toward Champion Hill. So he gets these key assignments despite this sort of negative Nelliness, and does pretty well and sort of cements that trust of Grant's. Derek, as you're thinking about Vicksburg, what jumps to mind for you as far as Sherman's performance?
Well, you know, to what Cecily said, and to some extent what you're outlining here, the moment that seems key to me is when Sherman is asked to assault Haynes Bluff while the army is crossing the river. You know, he's not supposed to make an authentic attack, but he's supposed to make a strong demonstration. And, you know, he writes a letter and he says, well, he has his doubts about this campaign. This is what Grant wants. I'm going to give Grant what he wants, and I'm going to do the very best I can, even while, you know, he's telling others that, you know, he's not sure that what Grant is up to is the right thing. But that loyalty comes through very strongly in that moment. And it's not unobserved by Grant. And then when Grant crosses the river and Sherman is finally let in on the fact that Grant intends to live off the land here, Sherman is shocked, right? And even says, you know, you're going to have to build new roads. You can't do this. You haven't thought this out. And so, you know, Sherman and Grant are so close that things that Grant might not take from other people or see as insubordination from other people is seen as constructive criticism from Sherman, and it's kind of welcomed, you know? I think those are the defining moments in that campaign for me.
Yeah, I would agree that's Grant takes those in the spirit that really are helpful to him. That's really helpful to him rather than being defensive about it. Dave, other Vicksburg related assessments from you?
Well, just that at one point, Sherman literally has Grant's back when he's given the task of keeping Joe Johnson off of Vicksburg, which I find fascinating because it's really their first time that those two generals face each other. And they'll spend close to a month sort of thinking about what the other's going to do. There's not a lot that happens during that month, but I've always you know, I've spent a lot of time now with the Atlanta campaign, sort of wondering what was running through Sherman's mind, you know, in June 1863 when he's decided when he knows he has to deal with Joe Johnson if Johnson comes out.
And it's not necessarily an assignment Sherman's excited about because he wants to go be part of the capture the city. Like everyone's getting to march in the city, and he's told, "No, I need you to go take
Right.
care of this stuff." You know, finally once and for all. Which gets us to that siege of Jackson that kind of got me thinking about this in the first place. And he does drive Johnson away, but doesn't pursue him and just sort of calls it good enough so he can come back. To me, that was a really interesting decision, and an interesting moment in his career. I don't know if any of the three of you have kind of thought about that particular episode. If so, I'd be glad to have you chime in on it.
It's just Union Army tradition. You never pursue retreating Confederates. That's just what they do. I mean, ask George McClellan and George Meade.
Well, there are some logistical problems for Sherman if Johnson is falling back onto a secure supply line. Sherman would be marching away from what is now for him a wagon-borne supply line because none of the railroads are functioning. So I don't think Sherman is you know, it won't be till next February towards Meridian that Sherman realizes that he can accomplish this and that they can operate at a greater tether from a railhead than he has before. So.
And you know, one thing too, I'll add to that too is Sherman's facing those supply issues. It's a period of intense heat, and water is a real issue for the army. So
Yep.
the Confederates have poisoned a lot of the wells as they've fallen back. So I mean, there are some legitimate reasons why you maybe don't want to overextend that, even if it means maybe not following Grant's final letter to the law there. So when Grant eventually finds himself in limbo for a while, eventually gets shifted over to Chattanooga. Dave, I understand you know a little bit about the Chattanooga area, right? Um, and then he calls Sherman over from you know, to help him out there, and of course we have that fight at Missionary Ridge. Um, how do you guys assess Sherman's performance there? Which it's easy for us to armchair general and be like, well, duh, you didn't look at the maps, but I know there's more to it than that. Um, Dave, let me give you a first comment on that since you're a Chattanooga guy specifically, and we'll go around the horn again.
Well, with regard to not reading the maps, not understanding the terrain, they also didn't make use of local guides or really the Army of the Cumberland's intimate knowledge of the area. There are plenty of federal soldiers in Chattanooga who understand about the separation of Billy Goat Hill and all of the tactical stuff around the north end of Missionary Ridge. None of them, however, are provided to Sherman. At this point, there's a little bit of distrust, I think, with Grant with regard to Thomas and the Army of the Cumberland in terms of their willingness to fight. It's one of Grant's most anxious periods of the war. He communicates that in his memoirs. It's also one of Sherman's personally darkest times. Um, the death of his son really does seem to have a huge impact on him. I can't get over the letters he writes and the comments he writes about after his son Willie dies, and the family goes home to Ohio. Sherman spends something like a week in the Gayoso Hotel in Memphis alone. And he talks about being haunted, seeing Willie around every corner. And that's, 6 weeks later, he's marching across northern Alabama. And so I think all of that plays into it. But it also highlights the fact that he's just not a good tactician. Doesn't coordinate the use of multiple brigades or divisions, doesn't use most of the troops that are assigned to him. Only about 40% of the troops he has available ever get into the fight. And so it falls upon the Army of the Cumberland and Grant specifically to sort of push them forward, and suddenly you have this momentous victory at Missionary Ridge. So it's one of Sherman's worst performances of the war. I regard it, it kind of puts all the emphasis on the things he's least good at, which are battlefield control and tactical maneuvering.
Cecily, you want to follow up on that?
Yeah, I think this is, so we pick up on this sort of thread of Sherman as not great tactician and also sort of unable to think on his feet in some ways, which is really interesting. Right, what is it, von Moltke's sort of axiom, every battle plan survives until it makes contact with the enemy. I think that's where Sherman kind of falls apart, and I think that's what we're kind of getting around. But the lack of local knowledge is really key, which is interesting. I think Sherman and Grant, taking Missionary Ridge is a huge deal. What Thomas's men do is incredible. They also got supremely fortunate that Braxton Bragg was still in command of that army. And that, if they were guaranteed one thing, it was that the guys on the opposing side were probably not going to do much in the way of foiling their efforts. So even though they make this series of missteps, I think Sherman and Grant both get off a little easy at Missionary Ridge because the guy they were facing was a pretty poor choice on the Confederate side. Like Missionary Ridge should be utterly defendable for a century if you really want to defend it. And yet Braxton Bragg, right? So, but I think it's this point that Sherman can't improvise in the same way that a lot of other Union officers seem to have this ability to do. And I think you see that he gets stopped by this valley and he's like, this is not on any of my, I was not aware. And he kind of can't think quickly enough. he kind of needs a plan to follow, and when that plan breaks down, it's a little bit kind of difficult. And I wonder if this sort of explains sometimes his behavior on the Atlanta campaign, because I think sometimes he's expecting Joe Johnston to do something like actually attack him, and then Johnston retreats again, and Sherman kind of has to go, what? And he like, part of the reason that campaign feels so stop-start and so halting sometimes, I think, is like Sherman is fully expecting his opponent to do one thing, and when they don't do it, he can't quite. It's like a record scratch in his brain. He's like, I don't have to reset my entire kind of a view here, and I think Chattanooga is one example of that. But again, it kind of didn't matter, so we should also kind of account for the fact that, like, even with serious missteps by the Union Army at Chattanooga, they had no really trouble whatsoever taking the ridge and lifting the siege.
Yeah. Derek, one thing I'd like maybe you to address, because you and I have talked about this a little bit. David alluded to the death of Willie and its impact on Sherman during this time. I know you've spent some time really kind of thinking about that. What's your impression of how that really folds into Sherman's actions on the battlefield?
Well, I think it's something he definitely struggles with to shut out, right, as a distraction. What a terrible thing to have to do, to grieve at the same time that you've got kind of a military emergency on your hands. A couple of things come to mind. We have to keep in mind the context of the 19th century too. These are Victorians, right? And the Victorians were highly sentimental. They also were very open to spiritualism. And I think Sherman operates within that reality, certainly. I do think that the death of Willie was kind of personally transformative in a way. And one of the things that really strikes me later in his life, when he finds out that his son has become a Jesuit priest, he has probably the worst crisis of his personal life, in my mind. He even says his son is dead to him. The death of Willie set the stage for his reaction to that. So I think that he's going to spend the rest of his life questioning himself as a father, struggling against domestic disruptions and distractions.
And that's one of those things that, to me, just as a parent, thinking about like the impact of the death of a child, and I can't even imagine how I would react. And so I think it's really important that we kind of address that for a second, because yeah, as you talk about this military emergency, and you're still kind of coping with this crushing event in your life. So we get through Chattanooga, the Atlanta campaign starts. Dave, I think you've got some expertise going on there right now as well. But really, Cecily, I loved your comment about the start, stop, scratchy record. Dave, as you're kind of unspooling this campaign in your work right now, are you seeing Sherman's reactions in that same way? Are you seeing him rise to the occasion? Is he wrestling with the ability to improvise?
Well, he's confronted by a couple of different problems. The first is his logistics issue. He has to supply what ultimately will be 150,000 men and 60,000 head of livestock when you count it all up. That's what's being funneled through Nashville to support this effort. About 100,000 men in the front line. And so that's a absolutely enormous, stunning logistical effort, unprecedented in the war. The second is that he has to be very careful in his mind not to give Joe Johnston an opening. His primary mission, that as he sees it, is to keep Johnston occupied. Don't give him an opportunity to either counterattack or equally disastrously, don't let him send any troops to Virginia, which is a constant theme in his communications all through May and June. In the first 2 months of the campaign. And then the final factor really is the terrain, especially as he gets down through, the campaign opens in the mountains of North Georgia. That's difficult terrain. But I think the Federals are almost shocked at how difficult the terrain south of the Etowah River is the Allatoona Range. That leads to Dallas and New Hope and all of this, all of these areas in Paulding and Cobb County that they're going to spend essentially a month slogging through. And that terrain is poor farming soil, so it's not well settled. So there are a few roads. There is not much farming, so there's no forage in the fields. It some of the stopping and starting of this campaign is simply that Sherman has to build up stockpiles of supplies. By the first week in June, about half of his cavalry horses are dead or dying. It's a shocking number, and so that poses a real problem for him. That's why you see the beginning of a pause about June 8th, not to mention 19 straight days of rain all through the first part of June. I think, but his overall concern is to make sure he doesn't leave Joe Johnson an opening. Fortunately, the few openings that do occur, as Cecily points out, Joe Johnson's not thinking about fighting, not thinking about attacking. He tries a couple of belated counterattack moves. He launches a couple of attacks at Resaca on May 14 and 15. He contemplates sending Hood on a flanking march on May 28th at Pickett's Mill. Hood arrives and finds a federal line entrenched, so he doesn't attack. I mean, the handful of Confederate counterattack efforts are very halting and very limited. And June 22nd, when Johnson rather pulls all of Hood's corps off of his right flank and shifts them all the way to the left flank, something that the Federals don't notice, by the way. And yet all that results is in a very messy affair at Kolb's Farm, which produces about 1,000 Confederate casualties and only a handful of Federal losses. Neither side does great in tactical attacks, tactical combat all through the first half of the Atlantic campaign. And then we switch opponents and you get John Bell Hood, and Hood is actually much better than Johnson in terms of organizing and coordinating attacks, except at the tactical level where it all falls apart again. And so none of those Confederate fights, the July 20, July 22nd, or July 28, are anything like close to success. So, but Sherman's primary role, or the primary reason for the success of the campaign, I think, is his logistical focus. The Army never really falters. And so he's able to keep his manpower up to strength, even as the Confederate manpower is in decline because of sickness and things like that. So,
and maybe that ties back into the points we made early on, where we talked about his larger vision and his operational success and some of those things. He's had the chance to burnish those parts of his resume,
right.
And so now it's really kind of coming to fruition. Let me rephrase my initial question in a slightly different way, because Sherman, he gets tapped to be in command of the Western Theater when Grant goes east. So, is Sherman overrated? Well, maybe another way to think about that is like, was there anybody else who could have done that job? So yeah, Cecily's sort of like, oh, who else could it have been? So and if the answer is there isn't anybody, well, then maybe Sherman isn't overrated because he's the best guy for that job.
Well, I do think that either Rosecrans or Thomas could have waged that campaign successfully.
Yeah.
I don't think Buell was capable of it, and the other choices we have from a federal command point of view, I think Hooker does very well as a corps commander in the Army of the Cumberland, but to give him Sherman's job, say he had not been relieved before Gettysburg, would he go west and take that job? I think that might be a bit of a stretch for Joe Hooker.
Yeah.
Uh,
And I don't think Grant's going to tap someone from the East to come do it. He's going to
no,
pick one of the guys he knows real well.
I think it's interesting that Sherman begs Grant not to go east, stay west with him, which in effect means he does not get promoted. And that's kind of an unusual thing for an Army officer. All Army officers, all capable Army officers want promotion. They want command. Otherwise, they're not really good officers. Or so goes the reasoning anyway. And yet Sherman doesn't want to break up the partnership, right? He wants to keep, he wants to be that loyal, trusted subordinate under Grant. And so when the Atlanta campaign begins and it's his job now, he still is fulfilling Grant's orders and communicating with Grant. What do you want me to do? Make sure that Johnson doesn't detach troops? Got it. I'll do that. So he's still focused on making sure that he's executing the orders he's given.
Now, Derek, when I posed this question, I saw you do the old chin scratch, and with your beard, that makes you especially smart. That's why I don't have a beard too. Did you come up with an answer to the question as you were doing the chin scratch?
Well, I think I have less faith in Rosecrans as a possible candidate for that job than Dave does. And I don't know about Thomas. I think Thomas was underrated. I think he was very capable, but he had limitations. There's no doubt that he was slow sometimes and ponderous in his moves, not decisive enough sometimes. I just don't know. I think that if Thomas and Johnson had faced each other in those mountains, it would have been a stalemate. I just don't see somebody else that could have been as successful. By the way, I have a class in 2 minutes that I am going to have to bow out.
All right. Well, we'll let you zip away here. But Derek, thanks for being with us. We really appreciate it. And good luck with class.
Thank you.
Yeah. Cecily, anybody you would see stepping up?
You know, Thomas was the first that came to mind for me too, but I'd take Derek's point. I think it's a very good one. He was, you know, he did suffer from the slows, as we know. I think what's really important is, okay, sort of tactically, yeah, maybe there's some people who could have done it, like who had the sort of ability. But the logistical side of it, I don't know that anyone quite had the confidence of Sherman that you could absolutely cut loose in that way. And then also the willingness. I think it takes a very kind of trained military mind to be able to kind of parse out the destruction that campaign also required, and to be willing to take ultimate responsibility, to be the person who the wrath of Georgia and the Carolinas would be focused on. I think that would have scared a lot of commanders. Remember, this is a very conservative army. This is an army that sort of believes, even till the last days of the war, that the more gently we treat the South, the easier reconciliation will be by the end. It's this McClellanist idea that takes hold of a lot of army officers at the beginning of the war. Very few are able to shake that. Sherman is one of them. He is the kind of guy who says, I'm going to do what needs to be done in the name of victory. I don't know that, like, the mental toll, and it's interesting we talk so much about how affected Sherman was early in the war by sort of terrors of what was required of him. By the time we get to 1864, he seems to have shaken that to the point where he can say, I am fine with being the guy that is still going, like, whose name is going to sort of evoke sort of wrath in Georgia, even in 2024. You know, 160 years later, there's still parts of that state where you can't say his name. And so I think that's really, really interesting. And, you know, his willingness to, whatever you want to call it, sort of evolve total war, embrace it, or kind of forge it through these campaigns, is not necessarily something I could see a Thomas or a Rosecrans really doing, and doing kind of somewhat gleefully. And sort of the way that Sherman keeps his account of, like, we did this many millions of dollars in damage and the rest was pure waste. Like, he's thrilled to be reporting this. And I don't know that a lot of those guys would have wanted to take on the responsibility and have that sort of on their shoulders for the remainder of their careers.
Yeah, that was a great insight, comparing that 61 to 64. The other factor too, and Dave, I'm glad you brought that up because, if Grant's going to the east, although he doesn't think he's staying at the east, quite at that point yet, but if he's going to go, he's going to have someone he can trust behind, and there really isn't anybody who has that trust. So,
Right.
I think maybe Rosecrans might have the logistical mind to make that campaign happen, but he doesn't have Grant's trust at
Not at
all.
all.
So there's no way he could effectively serve in that role. And I think Grant and Thomas are sort of staring at each other, like two boxers. I don't think that trust would be there either. So I'm just keeping an eye on the time, knowing that we do have to wrap things up here in a second. Um, you know, Sherman is the guy who has Atlanta fall, which is a huge, huge domino piece for Lincoln's reelection. So, if we're thinking, is he overrated or not? Well, he does do that. That's pretty important. He captures Savannah, pretty important. So, I suppose we could talk about some of the steps along the way and all the way up to Bennett Place. But, those are pretty key moments that I think probably justify a lot of his reputation. What's your final assessment as we kind of revisit that question and we've had the chance to armchair general with the four of us a little bit? Is Sherman overrated? Dave, I'll have you go first this time.
Sherman has sort of become at various times a cult figure of he's like the anti-Grant, the Grant's the bloody butcher. Sherman becomes exalted by Captain Liddell Hart, the British theorist who calls him the master of the indirect approach. So in that sense, I think he is a bit overrated. Also, his reputation for hard war, Sherman the terrorist, is dramatically over exaggerated. But that said, he does. There's a reason why he's one of the two or three leading Union generals of the war. And he can point to a number of important successes, Atlanta being, way up there with it. So I don't regard him as overrated. I sometimes see him as oversold. I guess that's the way to
Ah,
put it.
very good. Nice little rhetorical twist there, Mr. Powell. I appreciate that. So, Cecily, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think Sherman is, I think he's fairly properly rated. I think it's hard to, I think we spend so much time assessing him just in the context of the Civil War that we forget that he had a 20-year Army career on either side of the conflict as well. That if we actually want to think about him as a soldier, like those are also really important. We think about him as a soldier in this really intense crucible 4-year period. I think he was one of the most important American soldiers, I would say, in history, maybe certainly in the 19th century, in terms of kind of his understanding of the relationship between the military and the American state. And I don't think we can kind of understand the evolution of the American army without understanding Sherman. I think in the Civil War, I think where we kind of came around to at the end, I'm not sure anyone else could have done what he did from 64 on so successfully. So I think in that sense, he is properly rated. I also think that we have to factor into sort of how we assess Sherman. None of us would understand the Civil War as well as we do or think we do without Sherman's writings, without his memoirs, without what he left behind. And so one of the things that made him so important, not only during the war, but sort of continues to make him a figure that deserves our attention and respect, is that he left us a record of the war that's almost unmatched by any other Union officer, certainly any who was as important as he was. And so for that reason too, I think, we have to rate him pretty highly because to history, he left this kind of sort of invaluable archive of the war and the kind of inner functioning of the Union armies at their highest level. And we have to be really grateful for that, because not every officer was capable of doing it. Not every officer was capable of assessing their own careers with as clear of an eye as Sherman could assess his. And that's what also makes him really interesting. For a guy who was that important, he didn't necessarily have the ego to go with it. And so I think that's a really interesting and kind of neat thing about him too. But Dave is right. He becomes an avatar for all kinds of things. And what that tells you is he's a really, really complex dude who lived a massively interesting life in the most transformative period in American history. And each of our listeners and readers here at Emerging Civil War probably has their own opinions on Sherman. And the nice thing is there's so much there to read and consider that each of those opinions is pretty valid and can be backed with evidence. And so I think he's not someone we're going to stop talking about. You know, even as the field changes and our interests change, Sherman will have something to say or something of value to tell us about the Civil War long after all of our books are gathering dust on shelves, you know, hopefully across the country.
So here I will sort of peel back the veil just a little bit and admit that my premise is really sort of a straw man, you know, to say, is he overrated? To me, the value in asking that question is it's an opportunity to then try to answer the question rather than have an answer for the question. And then that gives us that opportunity to explore and find out all these pluses and minuses and things that he did and things that he didn't do, things that he could have done better. Here's why he didn't do them as well as they did, you know, and so, you know, it's a great lens for examining a figure like Sherman. I don't think it's necessarily a useful question to have an answer in and of itself for. So thanks for letting me set you guys up because you guys gave me some wonderful, wonderful things to think about today. The other thing I'll just encourage our readers to do, aside from Sherman's memoirs, which are still pretty easy to access, they're in public domain, certainly. But if you read his correspondence, his wartime correspondence, those letters, that collection of letters co-edited by Brooke Simpson, a wonderful, wonderful set of letters that are, you know, capturing his thoughts in real time as he's talking to his wife, to his brother, other folks. And so great set of correspondence there. I want to also give just a final shout out because you guys do have some smart things to say to this conversation. Cecily's book, The Army Under Fire, and Dave's campaign study of the Atlanta campaign. Check those things out as well. So Dave, Cecily, thank you for both for being with me today.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you for having.
You guys rock. And thanks again to Derek Maxfield, who's off doing his teacherly duties. I'm Chris Mackowski. Thanks for being with us here on the Emerging Civil War podcast. We'll see you online and on the battlefield.